Welcome to Mental Flight, where bold ideas take off and untold truths soar beyond the limits of ordinary thinking. Then fasten your mind, you're cleared for takeoff. In a move that's sending ripples through global markets, Burkina Faso has officially signed a $2.6 billion soybean export deal with Saudi Arabia, marking one of the largest agricultural trade agreements in African history. This groundbreaking development represents more than just numbers, it's a major geopolitical and economic shift that signals Africa's rising importance in global food security and resource supply chains. At the center of this transformative deal is Ibrahim Traoré, the dynamic and bold leader of Burkina Faso, whose recent actions continue to shake up the traditional balance of power across the continent and beyond. The agreement with Saudi Arabia is not just about soybeans, it is about vision, sovereignty, and the strategic realignment of African trade toward independence and empowerment. For years, African nations have exported raw materials under exploitative contracts with minimal local gain. But Traoré's government is setting a new precedent, negotiating trade terms that prioritize national development, value addition, and long-term agricultural sustainability. The Saudi demand for soybeans has surged in recent years due to efforts to diversify its economy away from oil and secure reliable food sources for a growing population. Burkina Faso, with its fertile land and growing agricultural sector, has seized this moment. Under this deal, Burkina will increase production, invest in sustainable farming infrastructure, and partner with regional farmers to meet the high export demands. This opens doors for thousands of local jobs, boosts rural economies, and enhances the country's overall GDP. But what makes this deal truly remarkable is its symbolism. Saudi Arabia has traditionally leaned on Western nations for major imports, but now it turns to Africa, specifically to a nation like Burkina Faso, that is rewriting its political and economic story on its own terms. Traoré's assertive Pan-African stance and resistance to neo-colonial economic models make this partnership both unexpected and revolutionary. It signals that Africa is no longer content to be the world's supplier of raw materials under unfair contracts. Instead, it's emerging as a strong, self-assured player that demands mutual respect and equitable exchange. For Saudi Arabia, the deal also reflects a calculated shift. In a time when global food insecurity is increasing due to climate change and war, building alliances with nations that can provide sustainable, stable agricultural output is a necessity. The kingdom's investment in Burkina Faso may be seen as a hedge against future volatility, but it also acknowledges Africa's rising strategic value. Traoré's administration plans to reinvest a large portion of the revenue into modernizing agriculture, training young farmers, and building regional distribution networks. By doing so, Burkina Faso is not just exporting soybeans, it's building an agricultural economy that can support itself for generations. International observers are closely watching how this deal unfolds. If successful, it could become a blueprint for future African negotiations, inspiring other nations to secure more favorable trade terms that prioritize national interests. The ripple effect could redefine how the world does business with Africa, finally placing the continent in a position of strength, not subservience. This agreement is also a testament to how strategic leadership, backed by national vision and political courage, can unlock opportunities that were once considered impossible. It shows that with the right leadership and a clear sense of purpose, even a landlocked country like Burkina Faso can become a cornerstone of global trade. The $2.6 billion soybean deal is not just a transaction, it is a statement. A statement that Burkina Faso is ready to lead, ready to rise, ready to feed the world and itself with pride and power. Burkina Faso's $2.6 billion soybean export deal with Saudi Arabia is not just an agricultural agreement. It is a seismic shift in the global trade landscape that signals Africa's arrival as a serious player in the food supply chain. For decades, Africa has been viewed primarily as a recipient of aid or a source of raw materials under foreign control. But this deal flips that narrative. It positions Burkina Faso not as a dependent player, but as a sovereign nation, capable of commanding billion-dollar trade agreements on its own terms. The sheer scale of the deal places it among the largest agricultural trade agreements ever signed by a West African country. It sends a powerful message that Burkina Faso is ready to lead Africa into a new era of resource-based economic strength. At the heart of this deal is soybeans, one of the most strategically important crops in the world today. Used for food, animal feed, and biofuel, soybean demand has surged across the globe. As countries like Saudi Arabia work to diversify their economies and reduce dependence on oil, they are looking to secure stable, long-term agricultural imports. Climate change and geopolitical instability have made food security a top priority. For nations with limited arable land, Saudi Arabia, with its desert climate and water scarcity, needs reliable partners to meet its growing food needs. Burkina Faso, with its vast stretches of fertile land and underdeveloped but promising agricultural sector, has stepped into that role with boldness and clarity. The agreement will see Burkina Faso significantly scale up its soybean production. And this means more than just planting seeds. It will require strategic investments in farming equipment, irrigation, fertilizer access, logistics infrastructure, and farmer training programs. This is not merely a crop forecast transaction, it's an opportunity for agricultural transformation. Thousands of Burkina farmers stand to benefit directly from the increased demand. With new jobs, higher incomes, and access to better tools and resources. The government's role in facilitating this deal also opens the door for state-led investment in rural development, research into high-yield soybean varieties, and improved storage and transportation systems. These structural improvements will have lasting benefits far beyond the soybean industry itself. Another critical element is how this deal empowers Burkina Faso to engage on equal footing in the global economy. In the past, African trade deals especially in agriculture have often been unfair, with most of the profits flowing to foreign corporations or middlemen. But this time, Burkina Faso has taken a different approach. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, the country has insisted on terms that respect its sovereignty and ensure that a significant portion of the revenue stays within the country. This includes provisions for local processing and value addition, meaning that Burkina Faso will not simply export raw soybeans, but will also process some of them into oil, meal, and other products. This step is crucial in breaking the historic cycle of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. At a higher cost, Saudi Arabia's decision to partner with Burkina Faso is also worth examining. The kingdom is diversifying its strategic alliances and moving beyond its traditional Western suppliers. This deal reflects a new kind of diplomacy, one rooted not in charity or aid, but in mutual interest. Saudi Arabia gets a reliable source of soybeans at a competitive price, while Burkina Faso gets a massive boost in economic activity, infrastructure development, and geopolitical recognition. It's a partnership based on shared goals, not imbalance. This move also enhances regional trade cooperation in West Africa. As Burkina Faso ramps up production, it may rely on neighboring countries for labor, transportation corridors, and even joint processing ventures that could strengthen the entire West African agricultural economy and create new networks of collaboration across the region. Furthermore, the visibility of this deal may encourage other African nations to pursue similar partnerships based on equity and national benefit. It sets a precedent. African countries can negotiate billion-dollar deals that serve their interests without bowing to external pressure or predatory terms. The announcement of this deal has already begun to attract attention from international investors and development organizations. Seeing that Burkina Faso can operate at this level increases its credibility and makes it more attractive for future investment. It demonstrates that the country is not only politically stable but also capable of executing large-scale trade agreements with global partners. That reputation alone can open new doors in sectors like finance, infrastructure, and manufacturing. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this deal is the psychological shift it represents. For too long, African nations have been seen as peripheral players in global commerce. This agreement forces the world to reconsider that perception. It shows that with visionary leadership, strategic resource management, and a commitment to the $2.6 billion soybean export agreement between Burkina Faso and Saudi Arabia, represents a major turning point in Africa's journey toward becoming a dominant player in global food trade. For decades, the continent's vast agricultural potential has remained largely untapped or exploited under unfair trade structures, often dominated by foreign interests. But this deal signals a profound shift, a declaration that Africa is no longer content to play a passive role in the global economy. Instead, it is stepping forward with bold partnerships that promote fair trade, economic independence, and long-term strategic positioning in one of the world's most essential industries, food production at its core. The agreement does more than just facilitate a massive soybean export. It repositions Africa as a reliable and powerful contributor to global food security, as climate change, water shortages, and geopolitical instability disrupt traditional food supply chains. Nations like Saudi Arabia are looking elsewhere for dependable sources of agricultural goods. With abundant arable land, a youthful population, and an increasing commitment to modern farming techniques, Africa is uniquely positioned to fill that void. This deal is proof that the continent can deliver not just in theory, but in execution, scale, and value. The structure of this particular agreement is especially important. Rather than relying on foreign multinationals to extract, transport, and profit from African resources, the Burkina Faso-Saudi Arabia deal is being led by a sovereign African government with terms that favor national interests. This is critical for economic independence. When African countries control the terms of trade, including pricing, labor, value addition, and revenue sharing, they not only capture more of the profit, but also use it to reinvest in their own infrastructure, technology, and people. This keeps the wealth generated from Africa's natural and agricultural resources circulating within African economies rather than flowing outward. Moreover, the ripple effect of such an agreement extends far beyond Burkina Faso. Other African nations are watching closely, seeing in this partnership a model for how to leverage their own agricultural strengths to attract high-value global deals. It encourages them to negotiate not from a place of desperation or dependency, but from strength and strategy. Africa has long been seen as the world's breadbasket in waiting, but now it's beginning to function as the breadbasket in action. The soybean deal is a symbol of that awakening. This agreement also acts as a catalyst for regional cooperation. As Burkina Faso increases soybean production to meet the demands of the Saudi market, it will likely need to collaborate with neighboring countries to access shared infrastructure like roads, railways, storage facilities, and ports. This encourages cross-border trade, harmonization of agricultural standards, and even shared investment in research and development. As a result, economic gains are not confined to one country. They radiate throughout West Africa and beyond, fostering collective growth. Another factor that makes this agreement so consequential is its impact on global perceptions of Africa. Historically, the continent has been viewed primarily through the lens of crisis, famine, poverty, corruption. Tales like this one challenge that narrative and replace it with a new image, one of strength, capability, and economic relevance. When Africa participates in the global market as a supplier of essential commodities under its own terms, it shifts its role from aid recipient to trade partner. That change in perception increases investor confidence, which leads to more partnerships, infrastructure development, opportunities for growth. Food trade in particular is an area where Africa can lead with authority. The continent possesses 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. With proper investment in irrigation, climate-smart agriculture, and storage, it has the capacity to feed itself in large parts of the world. The soybean deal proves that such potential can be monetized at a scale once reserved for larger, more industrialized economies. This brings economic independence within reach, especially if African nations focus on exporting not just raw crops, but processed and valuated goods that generate greater revenue and domestic employment. The partnership with Saudi Arabia also reflects a rebalancing of Africa's global alliances. Rather than relying solely on Western powers, African nations are now engaging with a wider range of countries, including Gulf states, BRICS members, and Asian economies, to forge mutually beneficial agreements. This diversification reduces dependency and increases Africa's bargaining power. It allows African governments to choose partners who respect their sovereignty and are willing to invest in long-term development rather than short-term exploitation. Internally, this agreement pushes governments to modernize their agricultural sectors. To fulfill the demands of a $2.6 billion export contract, Burkina Faso will have to improve logistics, upgrade rural infrastructure, train farmers in advanced cultivation methods. This strengthens the domestic economy and increases food security within the country, even as it exports to international buyers. It's a double win: economic growth through exports and increased resilience at home. Perhaps most importantly, the soybean deal reinforces the idea that African solutions can solve global problems. As the world faces a looming food crisis exacerbated by war, climate shifts, and population growth, Africa's role becomes indispensable. Agreements like this one show that the continent is not waiting to be saved. It is offering solutions, leading trade, and asserting its rightful place in the global economy through bold, visionary leadership and strategic alliances. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has undergone a bold transformation that is redefining its place in the global economy. His governance is not merely about internal reform, but represents a much broader, strategic shift in how the country engages with international partners. Traoré's approach has moved away from the legacy of unequal, neo-colonial economic arrangements that have long disadvantaged African nations. Instead, he is pursuing a model rooted in sovereignty, fairness, and long-term national benefit, especially when it comes to trade partnerships. This shift became glaringly evident with Burkina Faso's recent $2.6 billion soybean export deal with Saudi Arabia. While the numbers alone are impressive, the philosophy behind the deal speaks volumes. Traoré has emphasized that trade must serve the people of Burkina Faso first and foremost. It must empower farmers, build local infrastructure, and leave the nation economically stronger, not more dependent. This belief in self-determined economics is what sets his leadership apart. For the first time in decades, this bold, independent approach also sends a powerful signal across the African continent. Traoré's actions are being watched closely by neighboring countries, many of whom are also seeking alternatives to traditional economic models. The idea that an African leader can stand firm, negotiate fair trade deals, and demand equal treatment in the global marketplace is inspirational. It is helping to birth a new era of Pan-African leadership that values collaboration among African nations while still asserting national sovereignty on the world stage. Domestically, Traoré's focus on fair trade is having tangible effects. His administration is directing funds from trade revenues back into the economy, specifically into rural development, education, and agricultural infrastructure. This reinvestment model is critical because it ensures that the wealth generated from global trade actually reaches the people, particularly in regions that have been historically marginalized. Farmers are being trained in modern techniques. Cooperatives are being formed to give producers more bargaining power, and the state is actively working to eliminate the middlemen who have long exploited. Small-scale growers for profit. Traoré is also addressing the corruption and inefficiency that often undermine trade deals in developing countries. His government has pledged transparency and accountability in all new economic agreements. Contracts are being reviewed publicly. Deals are being signed with clear terms. And the emphasis is always on long-term sustainability, not short-term gain. This new level of discipline is earning the trust of international partners while reassuring the Burkina people that their resources are finally being handled with integrity. Another important element of Traoré's leadership is the way he integrates trade policy with national identity and pride. For him, fair trade isn't just about economics, it's about dignity. It's about breaking the chains of economic colonialism and showing the world that African nations can lead, innovate, and negotiate like any global power. This narrative is resonating deeply with a new generation of Africans who want more than survival. They want progress, ownership, and respect. Traoré is tapping into that desire and channeling it into policy that reflects both vision and courage. The global response to this shift has been mixed. Some traditional powers are uneasy with the new assertiveness coming from Burkina Faso. Others, particularly in the global south, are applauding the country's self-directed path. What's clear, however, is that the world can no longer afford to ignore leaders like Traoré. His insistence on fairness, sovereignty, and partnership, not patronage, is forcing a reevaluation of how global trade with Africa should work. It's no longer acceptable to treat African nations as afterthoughts in global commerce. Under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso is showing that fair trade is not a dream, it's a strategy, one that works when paired with fearless leadership and national unity. If this kind of truth opens your eyes and makes you think differently about the world, then don't miss what's coming next. Hit that like button to support bold content, and subscribe to Mental Flight so you're always one step ahead of the narrative.